Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I got into science as a high school student. Did a undergraduate degree at Boston University in chemistry with a minor in physics. There I did undergraduate research. That was kind of my first introduction to laboratory finance. Then I did my PhD in a really well-funded lab at Harvard. That was George Whiteside's, who probably ran on like, I don't know, $5 million a year in external funding, I would say. Then Jenan Bao, she was at Stanford in chemical engineering for my postdoc. She was kind of similarly well funded. I never really had to think about money as a trainee. It was all just kind of free flowing, although they would never admit it by other, by us mortal standards. It was free flowing. I started my independent career at UC San Diego in the Department of Nanoengineering, which is now the ISO Yufeng Li Department of Chemical and Nanoengineering. They got a big philanthropic donation recently of $21 million that is paid for the naming rights and also some expendable funds from the capital gains from that. And then I spent 4 years in the dean's office, first as our student center kind of director trainee, and then as the student center director. That was the IDEA Engineering Student Center, where IDEA is Inclusion, Diversity, Excellence, and Achievement. And we had about 6,800 student engagements per year with about 30 programs, and we managed a budget. I'm telling you all these things because these are the different ways that I've interacted with money in my academic career. So we had probably an operational budget of about $1 million. We had the unit still has a staff of about 8 pro staff, including some people in the dean's office that help with data analytics and calendar support and kind of typical stuff. And then another 3 million per year in student scholarships. So this is direct aid to engineering students. These are not scholarships that are part of a normal UCSD financial aid department, although they had to be coordinated through financial aid. So for the final 2 years, I was running my research lab and I was promoted to associate dean for students. Then because I don't know, pretty active on YouTube and Twitter, I got people kind of knew my name, and I started to get some outside attention for positions in leadership. And I, at the same time, realized that San Diego was really expensive to raise a kid, and our house had gone up in value by 3 times. And so we sold it, bought a house basically in cash in Rochester, a much larger house. And this position for department chair was open. So that's where I am now. So my lab is starting to get built out, but now I'm managing the department and the department's budget as well. So that's kind of the antecedent to where I am now, and happy to chat about anything you want to hear about.
How have things changed for you in going from Associate Dean for Students at UC San Diego to Chair of Chemical Engineering at University of Rochester?
When I was associate dean for students, I was proud of the work that we did in terms of raising funds and creating things for opportunities for students that didn't exist before. But that was all kind of not my day-to-day job. My day-to-day job was to sign forms and to run interference for the dean when students were complaining about stuff. I was the one that kind of went out there and had the town halls and things like that. And we had a lot of students in engineering at UCSD, 10,000 if you include all the undergrads, MS, PhD, and postdocs. It was a big group. As chair of chemical engineering at U of R, it is a much more compact role, but this department needs has been through a lot. um, when Kodak, Xerox, and Bausch and Lomb, kind of the big three of imaging, sort of either went bankrupt or divested or moved from Rochester, they were the primary players in the Rochester economy. And so chemical engineering was a big part of their success, and the university pulled resources away from the department. So the PhD program was actually canceled for several years in the aughts, and as a result, no one was hired in that period, and so there was a bimodal age distribution of faculty, and they all pretty much retired at the same time in the last couple of years. So 6 of those 14 research active faculty are new, and that includes me. Probably only one of us has external funding at this point. And so some of mine will transfer over, but my lab here isn't completed yet. So it will eventually move over from UCSD. And so the department is, I mean, operationally, it's kind of in the red because, we've taken money from campus to get the lab set up and stuff. But once everyone's research grant writing apparatus comes online, we'll of course, be self-sufficient in that way. So I would say that the number of tasks as chair are small compared to associate dean for students, but the gravity of the tasks is significantly greater. And I think the opportunity is greater too. We have a lot of room to develop relationships with alumni and local industry and our partner institutions in the region, but also other chemi departments in the country, so they know who we are and where to send their top students.
How do you manage the department's finances?
Sure. So at the department level, there's a lot less money that needs active management at the department level. So the department's budget is pretty big, but most of that goes toward faculty and staff salaries. And there's really, except when people are going up for promotions, we don't really control that money. I mean, it's allocated to the department, but we don't have to manage it, if that makes sense. The part of the budget that we do manage is what are you going to do with endowment payouts? You get some roughly 4% of endowed funds that you can spend per year on whatever the fund is allocated for. And then we have some current use gifts, which are based on pledges, and we don't spend the payout, although I'm sure the university does, because until we spend it, it's being invested somewhere. And so some amount of money is allocated, per year from those current use gifts. We have other funding available to us in the form of master's money, and there's some formula that the campus uses because master's money translates kind of monotonically to the amount of money that you have to spend on pretty much anything you want in the department. Master's money is pretty unrestricted, and that's kind of as an incentive to grow master's programs. Undergraduate tuition works a little bit differently. If our undergraduate numbers go up or down, there's kind of like a rolling average that is used to determine department allocations. But in general, you want to have your undergraduate numbers high enough so that you have enough cachet within the school to argue for resources, for faculty positions, for laboratory space, for classroom space, and so on. But it's not the same kind of one-to-one sort of correspondence as master's. Master's is not really one-to-one, but it's at least the more it is, the more you get. The more you have, the more you get. PhD is totally on the research side. So first year PhD students at U of R and some of them at UCSD got their first years paid for by campus. That money is officially routed through the department. So that's also money that is in the department's budget, but not something that we really have any control over because it has to be spent on a particular thing, that is first year PhD students. After that, it's all on the PIs. And I think this is a good opportunity to transition to laboratory management from department fiscal management. So a laboratory's budget is made up of a few different types of support. The primary one is federal grant funding, federal and state grant funding. And there is often an overhead rate, which is money that you have to budget into the grant, but it's not money that is not money that you have any control over once it gets there, and it's some percentage of the total direct costs. And so, if it's direct costs at UCSD, say it's $100,000, then you have to ask for an additional, I think it's $58,000 for UCSD, and it's about 54, 55 for University of Rochester because it's somewhat less expensive in Western New York than in Southern California. And so within those direct costs, some of those costs are not taxable by overhead, like student tuition, which is another hairy thing. It's not really tuition, it's tuition remission, which is a benefit paid out to the student for the privilege of not having to pay tuition. And it's actually, it's kind of like money laundering on the part of universities that do it. University of Rochester doesn't, by the way. I should say that very clearly. University of Rochester does not charge graduate students tuition nor require their PIs to pay tuition remission. So that's an extra, $30K per year for spendable on research, which is great, or another student support, which is great. And so, the other type of money is gifts. And usually those are current use funds. It's pretty rare that a donor gives a PI an endowed fund. Sometimes an endowed fund is in the form of a named chair, which, depending on the institution, costs maybe $1 to $2 million to call it, like the Darren Lapomi Chair of Chemical Engineering or something, and that position exists for eternity. And another type of money, oh yes, and gifts have a very low overhead. Some places it's zero, some places it's like less than 10% overhead. And that's of the total, with no different cost categories of direct versus, no overhead is charged on tuition or capital equipment purchases, but in all other cost categories are taxable by this overhead rate. Then corporate contracts, where they literally hire people in academia to do something for their R&D interests. Those are taxed. They are subject to overhead at usually the federal rate.
How often is overhead money returned to departments or investigators?
Overhead return rates to departments are a complicated beast, and the policies can change quickly, and there are kind of indirect ways in which good performance for research funding can lead to more money for departments. For example, the School of Engineering at U of R, if a professor has more than 3 months of summer salary that are budgeted into grants, like they're really successful at getting grants, they have more than 3 active grants and thus more than 3 summer months, although it's not always the case where one grant translates to 1 summer month. Let's just say it is. And so you can take that grant money and pay for academic year salary, and then the campus will return the money that it would have spent on you to the department, or to some mixture of some unrestricted account in the PI's name. That kind of thing can happen. There may also be teaching release, which is basically the school kind of subsidizing your research by pulling you away from teaching because you're getting paid during the academic year from a research grant. Direct overhead return, you're never going to get all of it, even in situations where there is an overhead return policy, because the lights still need to be on, the air conditioning still needs to be on. So maybe some departments might, I don't know, have like a 2 or 3 percentage point overhead return rate, something like that. But it's not going to be game changing. It's just a nice little bit of unrestricted money.
Is the policy on overhead returns similar between institutions?
I wouldn't I wouldn't say that this is a generalizable comment. Both systems exist at University of Rochester and UC San Diego to some extent, but it is entirely possible at a university to not have any overhead return and not have any provisions made for basically performance bonuses for getting a lot of grant funding. It's not really a performance bonus. That would be like illegal to charge federal grants like a performance bonus. But what it does is it says, okay, if you're spending 25% time on research effort and say you have enough grants to where you should be at 49%, then we're going to take salary away from you that the university would be paying and reduce your teaching load and your service load, and then you're basically just increasing the amount of money that you're being contracted for to do research for the government.
Isn't another form of expenditure startup funding for newly hired professors?
Yeah, so the startup funds, I've been here since July 1st. That was like 4 months ago. So I still have almost my whole startup from, the amount that they paid out to woo me over to New York State from California. And my colleagues who started also have startup funds. Those startup funds at University of Rochester, at least in my contract, didn't have a sunset date, so I could take as long as I wanted to spend that. It's not ideal to do that because of inflation, and but it's available.
Is it better to spend grant money first or startup money first?
Right. It's always better to use your grant funding first. One, because of performance requirements and you have to spend them down in a certain amount of time, and also because they are restricted to that project in principle.
How much power does the chair have over the budget or expenses of individual PIs?
As a department chair, I have some control over, or at least I have kind of the bully pulpit or power to embarrass people if they over commit to students they can't pay for. One thing that people maybe outside of academia don't realize is that most grant funding goes toward personnel costs. I mean, that's the same at any company. And so if you aren't cutting the mustard with grant funding, but you've committed to these students, the department can take students away from a PI, and we haven't instituted this yet because there hadn't really been a need to. But at universities, it's not uncommon for PIs to have to sign off on committing funds to students at the time that they take them.
Describe the tooling available for PIs to monitor their expenditures.
The tooling that's available for a PI to monitor their commitments and their spend rate are not very good. The the university has a, I think it's probably intentional. The incentives aren't really aligned in such a way that make it important for the university to produce a, or to hire a product that can put the information in front of a PI in real time, just like you do on chase.com or bankofamerica.com. And that's kind of like the dream. I don't see why it's so hard, but it's because the but it's because they don't answer to us. Like if someone wants to pay me a few $100,000 a year and give me a startup fund to move somewhere as an assistant, as a senior professor, the last thing that I care about is their financial management software. Once I get there, it may annoy the hell out of me, but I'm not going to be the one to say you've got to change your whole enterprise system in order to make this work. From the university standpoint, usually there's enough cash on hand to cover overages on grants until they can reconcile the accounts when they need to close out a particular grant. So a grant might be like negative 100K in the hole, but somehow they've the cash money has appeared from the university coffers, and they've fulfilled their obligations. But then they say, all right, Mr. or Ms. PI, you've got to tell me which other grants to put to replenish with this one, and then we'll go through the trouble of reconciling effort and doing things ex post facto.
Are some cost transfers riskier than others?
Yes, so there is a there's a category of low, medium, high risk cost transfer, and usually if they have a justification, then it goes through. To my knowledge, none of my grants or spending has ever been audited by the government, which is fortunate. The university does take some of the flack, and I'm glad in many ways that grants are awarded to the university, not to the PI legally. Although, if someone commits fraud or something, it's the PI who gets in trouble. So I don't know. They take on the benefit, but very little of the risk. They take on some risk, but Duke did. Yeah. Yeah, but at the same time, there are PIs who have gone to jail for, submitting two similar grants for the same project, and they accepted the money from both, and they're in prison. I doubt if anyone from any CFO at Duke is going to prison.
Is underspending ever a problem?
I would be shocked if in my current department underspending is a problem. I would say that we have more liabilities than assets at the moment. In cases where I have underspent, I will take the grants with the longest horizon and stop spending on them for the time being, and then do a redistribute available funding. The problem is, if you spend 50% of an account balance in the last month, that's really a high risk for an audit, and the university doesn't usually want that exposure. So you generally ask for a no-cost extension, Some agencies don't allow a no-cost extension without just exceptional, um, yeah, exceptional reasons. DoD is much less likely, at least the Air Force, which I've had 4 grants from, is less likely to allow it. DOE is almost automatic. NIH is almost automatic.
How often and in what form do you see the finances of your lab?
About once per month, I get a spreadsheet that's been downloaded from a system from my financial administrator. Half of the time I look at it, the other half of the time I don't. Sometimes it just, I do some accounting in my head after 12 plus years of doing this job that has turned out to be fairly accurate. And what I end up doing is, let me see if I can find this file to show you. Um, I
Are you expected to spend down your unrestricted gift funding within a certain period?
I break up the year into quarters, and then I assume that each cell in this spreadsheet is 25K. And that's 25K all inclusive. That is, you're going to say this is a ridiculously aggregated way to do things, but I take the that 25K per quarter accounts for let me see what I use. It includes stipend, tuition remission, overhead, fringe benefits, supplies and facilities usage, my summer salary, although I've taken way less than half of the summer salary from grants to which I've been entitled because my salary is way too expensive to charge to 100K per year NSF grant. And it also includes amortized costs of small instruments and capital purchases if they're small. If they're big, I need a separate grant to finance it. But this is, let me show you my color coding. These are all the students and postdocs that I mentored at UCSD. And then I started in 2012 and then all the way historically. And this is, I guess I've done my projections for this academic year, although I don't have, okay, the color code is up here. So blue fellowships, this is money I don't have to worry about because this is NSF or NDSEG money. The orange, this is money that I have to like eat what you kill kind of thing. Red is department money, so you can see this student was on a nanoengineering fellowship for this quarter, and then these are TA funded quarters. Or sometimes if a master's student comes in, then I'll post date their start date because if they came in as a master's student, they weren't getting a PhD stipend, and then they were self-supported. Haven't had startup in a long time, but that was back here. And then this is the gray is where I want to not be, and that is money that personnel that I've committed to, but don't know what the funding situation is going to be yet. Yeah, ideally you're not paying salaries on. Ideally, you're not paying anything on unrestricted funding, and you could just kind of spend it at the slowest possible rate, which the university will always get on your case for. In fact, one time the financial management system at UC San Diego was so dumb that I got an email for unspent gift funds, and I went to the link that they told me to go to, and it had my name and it said outstanding balance, and it was $0.16, 16 cents. And I'm like, that's a victory. That's, to me, sounds like a closed out account. And then I replied and I said, 16 cents, are you kidding? And then they wrote back a week later and said, Dr. Lipoma, you still haven't submitted a one-page plan for how you're going to close out this account. And I said, this is reading this email was a waste of my time. All right. Yes. Yeah. So that, there's not, it's all about who, the university is like, people who work at a university are like flies on an elephant. They don't know what the whole elephant looks like. They just know what's on their job card. And then it's really only the people at the top, like the CFO or the president's office, who are really the ones who will get in trouble if the financial management is not done right. And as long as because research funding is like less than a quarter of even an R1's non-hospital revenue, and maybe 30% of the non-hospital revenue is tuition. And tuition dollars are awesome because if you're plus or minus a few percent in research, you've got tuition dollars and to buffer it. And as long as you're arranging you're managing your finances in such a way that you can avoid audits and do the reporting up the chain that you need to, the pain point is borne by the faculty, and the administration don't see the pain of the faculty. That's why they walk around at some places, UCSD, with bodyguards. Like they don't want to be they don't want to be down with the rabble, right?
If you could wave a magic wand and get a financial management system that would work for you, what would it look like?
Yeah, if I could wave a magic wand and solve my fiscal woes, I would I would create a Chase or a Vanguard interface, and I would just, where I have my credit cards and my whatever accounts, my CD and my, you know, VTASX shares or whatever, and then I would just have all my grants. And I would be able to allocate my spend. I would be able to see what student was a TA on and which semesters, which ones were on fellowship and which ones needed a supplemental account on a fellowship. But the basic function would just be real time credits and debits. That's 95% of what I would want. Now, there's a be careful what you wish for aspect, because if the PI can see too much, if they have too much visibility, then they will feel a bit less shielded than they tend to by the fiscal admin staff, because they're like, do you want me to execute this transfer? And I just click and I just type, yes, execute that transfer. Like, if we had so much control, would we be expected to apply to get our second year of a 3-year grant directly from the program manager? I don't think I want to be the one to do that. I don't think I want to file for cost transfers. So it's one of those things that's a huge pain when you're thinking about it, but if you have funding, you're not thinking about it too often. You're like, whatever's in the budget, as long as whatever's in the budget that you submit to NSF, if you hew closely enough to it, you'll probably be fine.
How often and in what form do you look at your financial reports, and what information are you trying to get from them?
When I do look at the spreadsheet from my admin staff, it is often because new money came in and I want to make sure it's there. um, there are some times when I know that there has been a cost transfer and I want to make sure that I'm not hugely in debt on an account or in a negative balance on an account or overspending. That's the word they use. It's an overspent account. Um, I maybe it's not one out of every two. Maybe I don't look at one out of every three. um, uh, in so at any time a university changes anything related to its enterprise software, there is a huge problem. Like it doesn't it often doesn't work. Money gets apparently lost and then refound. Sometimes I'll open up that sheet because I want the dopamine hit of like, oh, there's still money in that account. Especially now because I'm spending down the money I had at UCSD, and I want to make sure that I don't have to write them a check from my U of R startup at the end of June when I'm hoping to be separated from my financial obligations there entirely. And so sometimes it's just it's kind of like gamification. Like how am I like same reason you would open up your Fidelity account.